We are going to go ahead and jump into Andy Vink's talk. So let me pull it up right here. I'd like to introduce Andy Vink of Boston College, who will be presenting on integrated evil. I'm going to try this, el mal común and the integral scale of values. Andy, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I'd first just like to say thank you to everyone for having me back. I have no idea how many times I've presented at Lonergan on the Edge, but it's good to, in essence, be home in a certain respect, as well as sharing my first kind of major intellectual breakthrough since dissertation stuff with a community that I know so well and is so welcoming, or at the very least is tolerant of my particular type of madness. So we're just going to jump right in. Doran's engagement with liberation theology in chapter 13 of Theology and the Dialectics of History comes from the need for theology to engage with a culture that distorts the various levels of the integral scale of values. Since the church is meant to be a community that is fully in line with the scale of values, theology dictates that the church must be a community of resistance that, through its ministry, creates a further community of resistance in the form of a world cultural humanity. As a part of this world cultural humanity, theology then must engage the cultural particularities of a community so that the church can understand what the community needs the church to contribute. What Doran describes is, in essence, the work of liberation theologies. A liberation theologian seeks to understand the context of the suffering of a particular community so that one can recognize what a community needs from the gospel to restore hope and be energized by God's self-giving love through the church. It is important to note that the idea of context is not an element only of liberation theologies or other contextual theologies, but of theologies and the theologians associated with them. To paraphrase one of Dr. Copeland's adages from a seminar years ago, even Aquinas had a context. The emphasis on context in this instance is to emphasize that instances of suffering are unique to each context and must be respected as such. A universal approach in light of these instances would only show a lack of attentiveness to the needs of a community. When this concept of liberation theology is put into conversation with a global political, economic, and technological order mentioned in the first paragraph of chapter 13, one can understand how a liberation theology fits into the integral scale of values. Considering how corruptions of social, cultural, and personal values can eventually lead to the maldistribution of vital goods, one function of liberation theologies is to critique and heal social, cultural, and personal values by way of articulating the voice of the marginalized communities. The core of Doran's argument in this chapter is that the framework of the integral scale of values provides a theoretical framework that complements the praxis-based framework of liberation theologies, which responds to liberationist critiques that transcendental methods do not sufficiently address the concrete realities upon which political and liberation theologies focus. Throughout section 2.1, Doran articulates how the framework of the scale of values and his conception of the distortion of values overcomes those critiques, showing that with proper application, transcendental methodology leads to privileging the position of the victims and making the preferential option for the poor the organizing principle for the ministry of the church. Given this argument, along with the development of Doran's thought since 1990, it is clear that Doran's work seeks a dialogue partner who is methodologically rigorous, historically minded, and seriously engages the Christian tradition in its prophetic nature to engage the distortions of social, cultural, and personal values. One opportunity for dialogue comes in the work of the Jesuit martyr Ignacio Ellacuría. Ellacuría's philosophical and theological work provides an excellent dialogue partner for Doran's liberative approach, complementing Doran in a way that few others in the Latin American liberation theology tradition can, primarily due to his nuanced understanding of history, philosophically oriented methodological rigor, and the recognition of the primacy of the poor and marginalized in the form of the crucified peoples. This section will start with a brief biographical note on Ea Korea to give an idea of how to flesh out what his theological vision is looking for and how it can interact. Ea Korea, a native Basque, spent the majority of his life living among and serving the people of El Salvador. After joining the Society of Jesus at 16, Ea Korea was sent to El Salvador in 1948, followed by his early intellectual formation in Quito, Ecuador, where he learned the Thomistic tradition as well as explored the work of Jose Ortega y Gasset. After returning to El Salvador for 3 years to teach in a diocesan seminary, Ea Korea went to study under Karl Rahner in Innsbruck from 1958 to 1962. After completing his theological formation at Innsbruck, Ea Korea wrote his 3-volume dissertation under the philosopher Javier Zubiri, whose dates are 1898 to 1983, entitled La Principalidad de la Esencia en Javier Zubiri. After completing his doctorate, Ea Korea returned to El Salvador, serving as professor and eventually rector of the Universidad Centroamericana Jose Simeon Cañas in San Salvador. He also worked with John Sobrino, among others, as theological advisor to Archbishop St. Oscar Romero, as can be seen in Romero's second pastoral letter entitled The Church, the Body of Christ in History. Ea Korea stood as a champion of the poor during the Salvadoran Civil War, following the example of St. Oscar Romero and taking on the mantle after Romero's martyrdom. Ea Korea was assassinated on November 16, 1989, along with 5 other Jesuits, their housekeeper, and the housekeeper's daughter in a planned attack by the Salvadoran military. While his life was cut short, Ea Korea provided a philosophically robust theology of liberation, making use of his extensive training under Zubiri. Given that Lonergan and Zubiri shared areas of interest, it follows that the students of both thinkers, such as Dorn and Ea Korea, should have ample room for dialogue. Ea Korea's liberative philosophy and theology can help further articulate how the critical element of the integral scale of values parallels Ea Korea's concerns. Ea Korea's theology, then, can provide one way of understanding how a concrete expression of the integral scales of values may manifest. So Ea Korea's philosophy builds upon a principle of praxis by addressing what human beings should be acting against, el mal común, or the common evil. This term, coined by Ea Korea, turns the natural law theory of the common good on its head, emphasizing the common problems and suffering that the entire community endures. By tracing the development of this idea from a mention within Chapter 5 of Ea Korea's magnum opus, Filosofía de la Realidad Histórica, to notes from our class lecture in June of 1989, the significance of the common evil to Ea Korea's praxis-oriented social philosophy will become clear. On page 590 of FRH, Ea Korea discusses Zubiri's concept of el pecado histórico, or historical sin. In its elaboration on the historicity of sin and how it implies sinful social structures, Ea Korea mentions the phrase maldad histórica, historical evil, which Ea Korea scholar Hector Samor argues is a common evil as such. The greater point Ea Korea is making, says Samor, is to argue against evil as a problem that can be solved by the natural progress of history. Evil is instead overcome by human praxis, intervening in historical events to alter possibilities, negating the evil in the present moment. When Ea Korea revisits this idea for his lecture in June 1989, the language changes to make the challenge to the idealized vision of the common good. Ea Korea begins the argument by highlighting the point that the common good cannot be sufficiently achieved if it is expressed only in abstraction. This implies that achieving the common good is not only a matter of simply the deduction of abstract principles, it requires a thorough understanding of the material needs and situation of a community whose good one is trying to achieve. This is in part due to Ea Korea's focus on reality, which has a necessary material component. This also fits quite well with Lonergan's discussion of the human good as always being concrete. Rather than focus only on the common good, which Eocuria claims is not a concrete reality for the poor majorities, Eocuria chooses to also focus on the common evil, which he defines as an evil that impacts the majority of a community. Eocuria's example of malnourished children in both Africa and in El Salvador represents the underlying conditions for defining a common evil. First, this malnutrition impacts the majority of the community, which is what common means in this context. Second, there is an explicit evil, in this case, innocence deprived of necessary nourishment. What this example also provides is an unenumerated element that, for Eocuria, undergirds the other two elements, a systemic structural injustice. As Eocuria notes, the reason children are malnourished in El Salvador is not because there is no food in the country, but rather because the vital goods that are within the country are already maldistributed, to borrow some language from Doran. These unjust structures enrich the few while dehumanizing those who are deprived of their daily bread. The issue of dehumanization is the focal point of Eocuria's concerns. The common evil, regardless of its form, is a structural injustice that treats the majority as if they lacked inherent dignity as human beings. When a community is divided and the inherent human dignity part of this community is trampled upon by means of oppression in any form, the common evil is present and must be overcome. When one puts this into dialogue with Doran's work on the integral scale of values, one finds a complementary pair of critiques that serve as the upper and lower blades, to use Lonergan's analogy. It is through these two critical apparatuses working in concert that allows for a more complete understanding of instantiations of evil and corrupted values. While the theoretical discussion that has taken place thus far is stimulating, it is important that the conversation turn to the concrete. This allows for the relationship between Doran and Eocuria thought to be put to work in careful analysis of the dynamics of social suffering. One particularly poignant example of this problem is the clean water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which lasted from 2014 to 2019, and its lasting effects on the citizens of Flint are still felt. The city of Flint is a small city of approximately 96,500 people, a majority of whom are Black, 53%, and approximately 40% of its citizens live below the poverty line. These demographic points will be significant when considering what the integral scale of values can tell us about the systemic failures that led to a half-decade of failure to meet basic needs. As a brief review, in 2014, the city of Flint switched its water supply from the Detroit Water and Sewage Plant Department to another source in Lake Huron to save money due to the city's state of emergency. Again, we're seeing some austerity measures put in place. This new source of water was contaminated, leading to lead exposures and an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. Between 6,000 and 12,000 children were reportedly exposed to lead through the water supply. Given the severe impacts lead has shown in the developing brains of children, this horrifying fact transforms the event from a short to middle-term problem to one with far-reaching and long-standing consequences. What followed were years of political scandal, failures to fix the basic infrastructure issues ranging from the polluted water source to the corroded pipes that needed to be replaced, to the threats of turning off water service for those with overdue water bills, leading to a drawn-out struggle for a basic human need, the consistent access to potable drinking water. In February 2019, researchers announced that test results showed that all Flint residents had clean tap water. While this news was something to celebrate, Politico's Derek Robertson found another reaction, a general sense of distrust from the citizens of Flint. People were wary that the water was actually not safe. In an interview with Robertson, Jim Ananish, Flint resident and Michigan State Senator, offered some perspective. I can't tell somebody that they should trust the claims that the water is safe because I don't trust them, and I have more information than most people. Science and logic would tell me that it should be okay, but people have lied to me. It is evident that this crisis has gone farther than just impacting the material conditions of the residents of Flint. It has shaken the very foundations of basic trust within the community. While the issue of of potability of Flint's tap water is in itself a manifestation of el mal común, and that it is occurring at the level of vital values, there is also an insidious problem occurring at the levels of social and cultural values. When one considers Dorn's dialectic of community, this becomes clearer. The dialectic of community is the tension between, quote, between a vital and indeed primordial intersubjectivity and practical intelligence in its work of establishing capital formation, economic systems, and political arrangements. Again, the dialectic is one of contraries, not of contradictories. Again, too, communities are headed to disaster if they so emphasize either the intersubjective pole or the pole of practical intelligence as to neglect the other pole. The failure to maintain the basic social trust necessary for society to function shows that the balance has not been kept. The question is, what pole has been overemphasized? Considering the emphasis on economic systems, political machinations, and austerity measures that led to the initial crisis, it would seem as though to be an overemphasis on practical intelligence. I, however, offer a more radical answer. This was not simply a matter of emphasizing one pole over another. Instead, it is a fundamental breakdown of the dialectic altogether. The undue suffering that pulsed through the community of Flint like a chaotic rhythm is symptomatic of the failure of the tension between the two poles to be maintained within the dialectic of community. Instead, the wire stretched between the two poles snaps under the force of corrupted values that lead to material injustice within the wider community. The poles of the dialectic, no longer held in tension, spin out of control like motors without counterweights, allowing for various forms of bias to run unchecked. In recognizing this failure to maintain the dialectic, one can articulate the depth of corruption running through a particular instantiation of the integral scale of values within a particular community. I call this integrated evil. Let us now return to the situation of the water crisis. It is immediately clear that there is a corruption at the levels of vital and social values. The good of order is corrupted and then manifests in the maldistribution of vital goods. It does, however, lead to another question. If this is just a matter of the good of order being corrupted, then why was the problem not simply fixed and life returning to some semblance of normality? Setting aside for the moment the long-lasting effects of illnesses mentioned, fixing the problem, while logistically tricky, could have been a plan of action in place relatively quickly. This is not to say that there wouldn't have been long-term issues of having to get all of the pipes replaced or changing the water source or other things, but this was a set of problem solving that supposedly intelligent human beings would be able to fix. The problem was more insidious. These failures show a rot at the level of cultural value, where meaning is placed not in the value of human life, but rather the maintenance of power. This focus sees the population of Flint, a minority-majority community with significant members of the population living in poverty, as a group that can be ignored or lied to for the sake of maintaining power. It is only through a form of healing through conversion that this kind of insidious evil can be transformed into the greater good, as Lonergan would talk about in the Redemption Supplement. So, in closing, what we need to be thinking about is how is the surd of evil then firmly integrated into the scale of values when we're looking at these larger systemic problems? Because that's at the heart of el mal común, recognizing that there is some sort of rot that systemically, in fact, impacts the community and almost always is destroying the lives of those who have the least ability to protect themselves. Thank you for listening, and I hope to expand on this in our following conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Andy. Very interesting paper. Let's go to questions now. Catherine, did you have a question?
Yeah, very briefly. One raises the question of capitalism, of course, itself and its corrosive value. One doesn't have. I always wondered whether someone can still be a capitalist, but still realize when it's run rampant, and whether there's a way to be able to stop that, either structurally or. My interest, of course, turned to education, but that's not a done deal either. I know a lot of people who are supposedly educated who just get lost into the corruption and the as we've seen in the Republican Party. I mean, there's plenty of people there you would consider educated who have just gotten lost in the whole power and money structure. But I was reminded also, as an example of that, of when John Kerry went to Vietnam years ago. I don't know if you all remember his interview with Johnny Carson. I think it was Johnny. No, it wasn't Johnny Carson. It was the guy before him. What's his name? I can't remember. But anyway, and his throwing his medals away. You recall that? Am I into history that nobody remembers? Nobody remembers that?
Vaguely remembering from during the 2004 campaign of when this stuff got dug up again.
Well, it got dug up again, yeah, but I remember when it happened. I watched the program that he was on. I remember that. And it was like he had this great insight of having gone over there, of how corrupted the Wall Street was, and coming in and buying, all the money that goes in, all the money in the transactions, capitalist transactions that went on around the Vietnam War as to be directing it. And so there was a whole corrosive idea of where that starts with the military people, and the people who are trying to fight a war in the name of democracy. And then here comes Wall Street, and here comes the industry that we've talked Eisenhower talked about in his farewell speech. That's the problem. The problem is that. So you raised the right question. I think can we remain capitalist? I think capitalism has a lot of things going for it. Of course it does. I mean, that's whole another issue. But is it so corrosive that it's just impossible to? It just ends up to be a matter of playing mop up all the time and not ever getting to the main idea. Anyway, thank you. I wanted to bring in the McCary issue because it's a long history there, going on.
Sure. So to respond to that, well, actually, that the issue you bring up about capitalism is the heart of my dissertation. That I am critiquing what we would call neoliberal capitalism, right? So the return to liberal idea, or classical liberal ideas in the form of work like von Hayek and Friedman, as then implemented by the Reagan administration and the Thatcher government, and the cultural impact that has. So bringing up the military-industrial complex as well. So this goes back to the late Martin Luther King talking about this in '68. The tripartite evils of the modern world being the interlocking elements of racism, the military-industrial complex, and capitalism. Having that these three are especially linked in American culture is something that's really important to be thinking about. So I think, though, to answer your question, part of it is, how do we understand capitalism? So the first is that we can understand capitalism as the wider economic system, which I think is part of the reason when we start talking about, well, it has its benefits. The greater issue, I think, is if we are actually to make a finer distinction, right? That capitalism is actually a mode of production as opposed to a mode of exchange. We all like the idea of commerce, right? Commerce has existed long before capitalism. And it's important, right? Because commerce, in the very basic of economics, to paraphrase Fred Lawrence, is that it's supposed to raise the standard of living for everyone, right? So in essence, commerce is a very good thing. But when we consider capitalism as a mode of production where if we want to use a little bit of Marx here, surplus value is created through the manipulation of labor. That's when things get trickier, and you are able to then have an entire set of entire class structure that can be dependent on people who arguably aren't actually doing work, which part of, I think, feeds into a cultural value of work becoming something not desirable, as opposed to a human fulfillment sort of issue. So I think I kind of got at some of the ideas you were bringing up.
Thank you for that. Let's move to Peter's question. Peter, I believe you may be muted.
Better now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
So it's about the structures of sin. A lot of things you mentioned. Now, there's all kinds of structures of sin, including the question is whether violence, political violence, is also a structure of sin. Now, as I understand it, Father Lonergan, in his economic preoccupation at the beginning of his life and the end of his life, he was approaching the question of standard of living. But maybe what he was doing was talking about human work and as enterprise. Now, there's a blessing on enterprise. After the collapse of communism, it's quite clear that the whole world over, there's a blessing on enterprise, but there isn't the same blessing on markets. So there can be structures of sin coming in, especially cornering markets in any way, where there's no competition or things like that. So my point is this: in this study, can we go with Father Lonergan and try and discover in his analysis and in his model, really, that diamond thing, can we discover the basis where we can get close to the magisterium of the church, particularly the social encyclicals, where we're really talking about the dignity of the human being being more in work than in property, and the implication of that being that property needs to be more widely distributed. So we're talking about everything: production, consumption, land. Now, to me, our thrust, when we talk about Wall Street, when we talk about the bankers and the capitalists, they may be involved in structures of sin and might not be able to get out of it. But the light of the gospel, the light of Lonergan and Father Doran, particularly the light coming from the Trina Uno, which is, the Holy Spirit, is the way for the body of Christ, the Christian community, to offer something the whole world over. So I would say science and technology, which seems to be the problem for pastoral life and evangelization, is actually the way ahead, so long as there's the kind of faith that Father Lonergan had in developing his own work, his own analysis, and his own techniques of thinking. And I think Father Doran is the proof, in a way, that Lonergan was succeeding. And I just hope, well, I'm so pleased to see so many people, young people, who are following these lines. It's a comment. My question is, are you in favor of violence? As simple as that.
So I am not in favor of violence as a general rule. I also come from a very, probably a minority position that I don't think the damage of physical property that is not human life constitutes violence. But I think that's a whole different can of worms. The issue I think at hand is you brought up enterprise, and I think that's a very good thing to kind of hone in on, because the thing is, right, in Smith we have the emphasis on thrift and enterprise, right, are our primary virtues of the endeavoring entrepreneur. The problem is, no one ever talks about, well, then what do you do with profit? Because the idea is that profit is then supposed to be eternally put back into more enterprise, right? It gives you an opportunity to then widen a portfolio so that you're not entirely dependent on one thing. So we don't run into things are too big to fail kind of situation, right? If a true market economy is working, there shouldn't be the failure of one institution that would totally destroy lives of millions and lead to a total collapse, with the exception of some failure of currency to actually have value. But that, again, another can of worms. So, and what I think, though, is the other side of this, that when you lose that sense of the thrift and enterprise, this is when you start seeing what Lonergan is dealing with in the early and later parts of his career, because the problem of evil is instantiated in the Great Depression, right? He saw the factories, the conditions and materials for production are there, but no one is allowed to work, right? Why? Because there's nothing to pay them with. So there's a fundamental issue then if we're running into some disproportionate way of thinking that when you have goods to be made and to sell, that all of a sudden these goods cannot be sold, even though people still have the material needs for them. So I think there's something there. As for the magisterial teaching, right, part of this, I think Leo the 13th gets a little wrong, is when he says that the church has to or maintains private property. Now, I think what he's actually talking about there is what Marx's language would consider personal property, right? My personal property, like my toothbrush, right? My house, would not be required redistribution. But private property, which is the means of production, I would even argue going as far as leased properties, right, would be something else that would then absolutely have to be redistributed, right? As in, if we think even back to Aquinas, if you're starving and you take a loaf of bread to feed you and your starving children, it's not stealing, right? It's the proper taking of what you have a right to by natural law from someone who is hoarding. So I think there's a way to get there. It's just going to take a lot of what Eocuria would call disideologization, right? That we are caught up in an ideology, which is a corrupting the view of reality and our understanding of reality in light of particular benefits to certain groups of people, right? So when we start thinking that private property and a entrepreneurial spirit is salvific, because that's really what we're talking about here when we're dealing with questions of capitalism, is that we have created a false soteriology that the market will save us, right? Because that's, if you think about all sorts of libertarian thought, right, let the market do as it will and everything will turn out fine. That's the reason von Hayek's Nobel Prize speech, the temptation to do good, right, that we should ignore that temptation because the market in and of itself will just solve all the issues. So Peter, I think you're circling around the right questions, and I appreciate your comments and I'll think more on it.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I think the question is money itself, the nature of money, which has changed historically, and even the pandemic is changing the nature of money, with the SDRs being distributed around the world. So I think if we come down to the micro level, the enterprise level, and think of money there. Lonergan talks about reinvestment, yes, in business, we talk about plowing back the profits, plowing, like a farmer plows back some of his seeds. But there's something else. The question is distribution, not redistribution, but redistribution. That's a promise of redistribution, which is basically the potential of property being distributed more widely. So the poor, I mean, why is it too much food in the world and too many people? The reason is the banker, the public banker and the private banker, that they're privileged in their activity because they're in everything and touch nothing, but they don't succeed. So in my opinion, Father Lonergan's approach through faith and the analysis of reality and observation of science, if it's brought up to the level of the money as an instrument, and here, more than anything else, it's the Eucharist that helps us, because Christ was a man as well as God, he had a dual nature. Now the Eucharist is the creation in both natures, from both natures. So there's the drive. There's the drive. The drive is within us, within our faith, to create new things in the spirit of Lonergan, to exactly get to the objectives you're talking about.
I think though I think part of the hard issue then with that, and I don't disagree with you on those premises, but then how do you implement that into the concrete reality of a pluralistic society, a lot of which is driven that their religion is not Christianity, it's not Catholicism, their religion is the market, and they're willing and more to make sacrifices of people on the altar of capital. And that's part of the issue too, is that if we are focused solely on the theological insight from a very traditional, quite frankly, Eurocentric Christianity, then it doesn't actually address the material conditions. And that's part of the liberationist critique, that it is not just the faith, but the praxis that goes with it.
If I can answer you, I think Doctrina Uno is the answer, particularly the four-point hypothesis, because the Holy Spirit is the outpouring of new creation. So we have it in us, because we're in the Eucharist, in the body of Christ, to dialogue with your atheist, your capitalist, and to compete as well. Now there's providence at work. If we have faith and act and suffer, there's a cross in this, that's our life. I'm an old man, I'm sorry, but I know from experience that this is the reality of the cross down these lines.
The one thing I do want to just kind of give a final comment then before I think we should give Steve a chance to ask his question, is that there is the issue of whether there is a cross that we willingly take up, or is it a cross that is imposed upon us unwillingly? And there's the difference. There is the difference, because a lot of the people who are actually suffering as a result of these economic inequalities, this is not a cross they willingly picked up. It is absolutely not. This is something that was forced upon them, right? This was not a moment of Simon carrying the cross willingly, accepting to carry the cross with Jesus to Calvary. This is an imposition. And there's the problem. We can't pray away an imposition. We can't ask for the Holy Spirit and for providence to simply guide us in our actions when there is a concrete reality that we rationally know. We can have understanding, we can judge it as wrong, and then existentially make the choice to partake and to end it. This is what you're describing, basing it on these very kind of in essence, pre-Vatican I kind of ideas from Lonergan's lecture courses at seminarians does not address these actual material concerns.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
All right, Steve, let's hear your question. I think this will be our last one.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Just curious about your description of the breakdown of the dialectic of community. If I understood correctly, so for Doran, the dialectic of community is one of contraries, not contradictories. So you're holding together the intersubjective aspect and the practical intelligence. And Doran typically says, I think as Lonergan, like when there's a dialectic, the problem is when one outweighs the other, right? When they're not in balance. But if I understand, you're trying to say that there's a different, perhaps new way of thinking about how dialectics might break down, and that is somehow there's just the tension between them is just non-existent or forgotten or something. And so if I'm understanding you correctly, could you just dig a little bit more into exactly what is the nature of that breakdown? Is it both of these might be existing and going well, but we just don't recognize the connection between them? Or I don't know if you can elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, so the way I would kind of put it is if we want to think of an image visually, that right when we normally think of, if we think of dialectic and overemphasis, think of it like a balancing scale, right? You have your fulcrum and your line, and you're kind of tipping one way or the other, and the idea is trying to find the right way of balancing, almost like the scales of justice, right? We'll take that image. The issue at hand is when the scale or the fulcrum is just shattered, right? That people forget that these things have to be in tension, or willingly don't want to put them in tension, right? That's a central piece of this, is that you can, if you say that is an emphasis on power, right? Which is part of what I'm arguing within this dialectic of community. This allows for I would say it's just completely lost, right? Because we have to make a dialectic work, we have to recognize that the poles are connected, right? I think that's the underlying premise, right? It's not just immediately obvious that intersubjectivity and practical intelligence are contrary and therefore we need to be balancing them. I don't think that that's a prima facie premise that we can just assume. It has to be recognized in the development of a community. And when the foundations of that corrode, right, of an understanding of what community is and how that community is, in essence, based on the tension within that dialectic, you lose that premise, and then these things can be left to go on their own. Does that help make sense? And they kind of spin out of control.
Kind of, yeah. I'm just wondering, I guess, and I don't know much. I haven't done enough reading on the dialectics, but I'm wondering if what you're describing, if the central mechanism isn't still that one or the other sides of the dialectic isn't just run amok, and that the reason for it might be that one doesn't recognize the tension that should be there. But in the end, the actual mechanism that is causing the problem, causing the total breakdown, the scale to break, whatever you want to call it, is the fact that knowingly or not, you are focused on one or the other of these tensions to the exclusion of the other. And that's just a thought or a question. So
sure.
Yeah,
I wouldn't outright reject that understanding of it. I think that is a way of articulating the idea, right? I'm fully accepting that our language is imperfect, and I think the idea that you're expressing could fit very well with the idea that functionally it is the overemphasis of one or the other, while under the theoretical underpinning is the loss of the recognition of tension altogether. I would want to, and I think the issue I'm having is that I want to place the emphasis on the loss of the mechanism, right? If I'm going to emphasize a piece of this, it's that it's not just that it's out of whack, it's that we don't recognize that these two things should be connected and that they can help maintain a tension, right? So that when you have your weight bearing, it doesn't just, shatter. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it makes me think of Doran's focus on that there's the real problem happens when we identify a dialectic of contraries as a dialectic of contradictories, because then we really get them out. And you're taking it to the higher level and saying, well, it's also a problem when we just don't recognize there's a dialectic at all, right? Which makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again, Andy, for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been very interesting.